Are we good? Okay, cool. So listen, it was about 175 years before the birth of Jesus. About 175 years before the birth of Jesus. And the people of Israel, well, they were ruled by Egypt. And you might think, given the kind of the baggage that Egypt has with Israel, that that would have been a bad thing. But as it turns out, 175 years before the birth of Jesus, the Egyptians were cool. They were great. They obviously they were in charge and everything, but they had no interest in, holding the Jewish people back or harming them. They kind of realized kind of what everybody else realized, which is if you're going to conquer a people, the nicer you are to them, the more peaceful everything is. And so the people of Israel were living these very nice lives. Technically, the Egyptians were in charge, but, whatever. Now, that becomes important because there's this other empire that pops up around that time. They are called the Seleucids. And the Seleucids, for whatever reason, they just have beef with Egypt. I don't know what it is. The Seleucids do not like the Egyptians. And there was particularly this one king. I'm going to call him Antiochus. He has this really long name I'm not going to get right. So I'm going to call him Antiochus. But Antiochus really hates the Egyptians. And so he declares war on the Egyptians. And the Seleucids win. And so what happens then is that Israel changes hands from Egyptian rule to Seleucid rule. And that was extremely bad news for the people of Israel. Because that whole thing I just mentioned where, it's better if you, when you conquer a people to be nice to them, the Seleucids did not live that way. They did not abide that way. And for whatever reason, Antiochus, it's lost to history why, but Antiochus decides he hates the Jewish people. Just hates the Jewish people. And he ends up around 175 years before the birth of Jesus, as this changes hands, he makes Judaism illegal. Like the religion illegal. That's obviously a problem if you're Jewish because Judaism is sort of all the things you do. He made all the holidays illegal. He made all of their forms of worship illegal. He even actually made circumcision illegal, which led to the execution of mothers who were circumcising their children. It wasn't good. And the Jews, pretty quickly realized this is a different animal than we've had before. It's certainly different than we've had for the last however many years with the Egyptians. And in 168 BC, when Antiochus decides he's going to completely eradicate the Jewish religion, the only way he knows how, he takes the temple dedicated to Yahweh and he turns it into a temple dedicated to Zeus, the Greek god. It was at that moment that they realized if we don't fight back, there's going to be, we're not going to exist anymore. And so there were some groups of people called the Maccabees. And the Maccabees fight back. They were outgunned, they were outnumbered, they were outarmed, whatever you want to call it, but they won over the next few years, 3 or 4 years. They end up winning this crazy battle, this crazy war. And so as they go back, they've won their freedom, at least relatively speaking. It's never quite so easy, but, quite so simple. But they go to rededicate the temple after several years, and they find that there's only this one jar of lamp oil, enough for one day. Certainly not enough for everything in the temple that needs to be lit. And so they do what they can. They light all the stuff. And that one jar, which is supposed to last for one day, lasts for 8 days. And now we have Hanukkah. I'm not going to pretend like I told that story well. I'm as white gets. Okay? Like, I am super not Jewish. Okay? But, that's the Hanukkah story. And ish, kind of. But so that's where we're at. We've hit the high points. We've done okay, right? So when I was I mean to look at this, I looked at YouTube, of course I did, and I watched a few videos to try to get a feel of things. And so that's how I kind of did preparation to tell you that story. 2,000 years ago, in the days of Jesus, they didn't have YouTube, obviously, but what they had was their Bible. And the Bible that Jesus and the disciples carried with them was a little bit different than the Bible that we have. It had some extra books in it. the Bible they had is called the Septuagint. And in the Septuagint, there's these extra books. And in those extra books, two of those extra books are called 1st and 2nd Maccabees that tell the story of the Seleucids and the Maccabees and Hanukkah and everything else. Which is to say this. Hanukkah is a very, very old holiday. It's a very, very old thing. And it was beloved by Jesus as much as it was beloved by anybody today. And so there's a lot of background information that you might find in the book of 1st, 2nd Maccabees that Jesus and his disciples knew, and anyone else they encountered, like, I don't know, the Pharisees, the religious leaders of Israel, a lot more information beyond just the kind of the bare bones Hanukkah story that they all had. And one of those stories that is a big piece of the puzzle for everything that went on with Hanukkah and the Maccabees and the Seleucids and everything else is a story that revolves around the Sabbath. A very sad story that revolves around the Sabbath. So we should probably say what the Sabbath is. I grew up believing that the Sabbath was Sunday because I was an idiot. But also sometimes people say things like that. The Sabbath is not Sunday. Sabbath is not the first day of the week. The Sabbath is the last day of the week. It is Saturday. And the Sabbath is not just really a day, but it's more a remembrance. It's a command in the law of Moses, a command in the Jewish law to take a day to reset, to worship, to rest, and much more importantly than anything, positive, to not work. To not work. This is before we had the weekend. It was before we had all that. The Jewish people said, hey, one day a week we're going to set aside. The reason they did that was in the creation story, in the very first chapter of the Bible, God creates the world in 6 days, and on the seventh day, he rests. And so it is mimicking that story. It's mimicking what God did there. Okay, got it. So that's the Sabbath. You're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. Rewind a little bit in the story. Before the Maccabees showed up, before anything else, the Seleucids came in and told the Jewish people, hey, look, you guys can't be Jewish anymore. You cannot worship the way you do. You can't circumcise. You can't offer sacrifices at the temple. You can't do anything. And sadly, most of the Jewish people kind of went along to get along. If it's give up your faith or die, most people will just ask God for forgiveness and not die. And so the vast majority of the Jewish people in Israel, that's exactly what they did. They kind of just did their own thing. But there was one priest named Mattathias. Mattathias was extremely respected by everybody. Everybody loved him. Everybody followed him. And more importantly, everybody listened to him. And so when Mattathias said, no, look, I know that you guys are just trying to survive, but if you give up our Jewish heritage, they will not be Jews in the world any longer. So Mattathias starts organizing ways to preserve the Jewish faith, to help people, to make sure that, different people, it may not be everybody, but at least some people would carry on the Jewish traditions. To that end, Mattathias started organizing settlements and camps outside of the major cities of Israel where people could hide. The idea is that the Seleucids they didn't know the land. They didn't know certainly they didn't know the wilderness. They were basically familiar with the cities. But if you got outside of the cities, the Seleucids had no idea where to go. So most of the time, like 95% of the time, I don't know, the vast majority of the time, you could hide from the Seleucids in the wilderness. Unfortunately, there was one camp that didn't hide or couldn't hide, probably because there was more than 1,000 people in this camp. They were taken from their home, cast from their home, and now they're out in the wilderness and they're hiding and they just want to be left alone. And one day the Seleucid army shows up and they see this massive encampment of 1,000 people, more than 1,000 people. Now, it's really important to understand, when I say more than 1,000 people, I don't mean more than 1,000 men. I mean men, women, and children. Realistically, you probably have a few hundred men at this point, and then the rest are, women and children, because that's basically how families work when you don't have family planning, right? So you have, a wife and several kids, and that's how it works. So a couple hundred, few hundred men, and then everybody else. Well, the Seleucid army shows up, and immediately like, hey, you guys have to fight. That's what we're here for. You guys are rebels. You guys are not following the law. We have said that you can't follow these holidays and worship, and you can't do this, and you guys clearly are. You guys are rebels who are doing that. So you guys have to fight, or we're going to take you into custody, or you guys can go and be like your other countrymen. It doesn't matter. Take your pick. And there was really only one problem. Saturday. It was the Sabbath. Which means to fight, even if you won, would mean you lost. Because see, if a king shows up and says you're not allowed to be Jewish anymore, and part of being Jewish is you don't work on a Sunday, listen, fighting counts as work. If that's what it is, then even if you win the battle, you've actually lost because you've given up your faith. And so the men, refused to fight. And they just said, whatever happens, happens. I don't think they expected what actually happened, though. Because what happened was every single man, woman, and child in that camp was slaughtered in a day. The Seleucids killed every one of them. Now, that's a horrible story. But it's also a vitally important story for the upcoming war. This is all before the rebellion even begins in earnest, right? And Mattathias, this priest, looks at the situation, and Jewish priests have the ability to interpret the law and interpret the scriptures. This Jewish priest, Mattathias, gives a new interpretation of the scriptures that had never been before. And he said, okay, if your life is in danger, you can break the Sabbath. If it's your life or an invader's life, and it's the Sabbath, you are allowed to break the Sabbath, and you're still following the law. This becomes very important for two reasons. Mattathias has a son named Judah Maccabees, the leader of the Maccabees. It's all connected. He was listening to his father on how to fight, and that included fighting on Saturdays. They never win their independence if one day a week they said, okay, never mind, we're not fighting. We're done. Like that, it wouldn't happen. The entirety of the Hanukkah story, you could argue the entirety of the Jewish religion existing today is predicated on Mattathias saying that the Sabbath now is interpreted as you rest unless your life depends on not resting. Okay, so I bring this up for a couple of reasons. Let's start here. There's a lot of Sabbath talk in the New Testament. And if you go to church a lot, like if you've been in church, if you've heard different preachers preach, one of the things you'll hear a lot about the Sabbath is it is, quote, just the Sabbath. Right? Like when we talk about the Sabbath, that it's just the Sabbath. It's just not working on Saturday, right? That's all that is. It's not don't kill or don't murder. It's not don't commit adultery. Like there's all these different rules that we read in the Old Testament, but this is just the Sabbath. I remember being taught this over and over and over growing up. That any conversation about the Sabbath it's almost like a lesser rule, right? Like it's almost like a technicality. But when we understand that more than 1,000 people, men, women, children, died instead of breaking the Sabbath, and that led to a change that you can only work on the Sabbath if your life literally depends on it. There's no just about this. The Sabbath in Jesus' day is at the core of what it means to be Jewish, what it means to be God's chosen people. And to break the Sabbath is not just anything. That's very important. The second thing, bring this up. Again, if you listen to sermons, if you listen to preachers, if you listen to teachers, one of the things you're going to hear over and over and over about the Sabbath is that there were different opinions on just what the Sabbath, the different rules. Like, because the whole thing about the Sabbath is you're not supposed to work, but one person's working is another person's working. Every old person I've ever met talks about the younger generations. They don't know how to work, right? Like, that's just it. So one guy's working is different than this guy's working. So what, just to say not to work doesn't give us a lot of instruction here. And one of the things you'll hear a lot of is, well, there's these different Jewish rabbis who have these different ideas. Great. I don't doubt it. Like, I'm sure. But what we have to understand is if there was an interpretation where the 1,000 people could be like, well, I'm choosing this interpretation so that way we don't die. I don't know about you, but I'm pretty sure they would have done it. Like, people aren't, you don't get 1,000 suicidal people, right? Like, people don't just want to die. They have self-preservation. All of these different interpretations that we see, absolutely, it's real, but none of them counteract this seriousness of the Sabbath. And that's incredibly important for us to understand. Because one of the most common things we see in the New Testament is Jesus arguing with the religious leaders about the Sabbath. How it applies, what we should do, who we should be, what it means to work. And in fact, Jesus is arguing about the Sabbath is an occasion for the religious leaders, the Pharisees specifically, wanting to kill Jesus. We talked about it starting last week. This is our second week of our series. Jesus eventually dies. But that's the right way to put that. Jesus eventually dies. Right from the start, people are trying to kill him. He's not a real popular guy as he, teaches and preaches and does all the things. And so one of the most common ways that Jesus got the ire of the religious leaders to the point where they wanted him dead was a conversation about the Sabbath. And as it turns out, when I say common, I mean this is in all four Gospels. This is a thing that you see. So, for example, in the book of John, we read about this story one day where Jesus goes and he's in Jerusalem and he runs across this pool, right? There's this pool that's supposed to have magic powers. And I'm not saying it does have magic powers. I'm just saying that the sort of people that want to believe that a pool has magic powers are the sorts of people who have exhausted other options, and they really, really want to believe that the pool has magic powers. People thought that there was an angel who showed up and stirred the waters of this. It was actually just a spring. Like, we know it was just a hot spring. But they said, oh, an angel showed up and did it. And if you get in the water, if you're the first one, it's this weird thing. If you're the first one in the water, well, you'll be healed. Somebody at some point must have given some belief about this, because by the time Jesus is in Jesus' day, this is a place where you go and it's just disabled people everywhere. And they're just waiting for the bubbly hot spring to show up and try to get in the water. And if you can imagine, it's this horrible thing. It's this really kind of distressing picture of the bubbles up, and then you get all these disabled people just fighting to try to pushing and shoving, trying to be the first ones in this water. It's kind of this ugly scene. And so Jesus comes upon the scene, and he's particularly drawn to a man who has been unable to walk for 38 years, says the Bible. Now, I don't know if the man was 38. He'd never been able to walk his whole life. I don't know if there was an accident when he was a kid and then it was 38 years ago. I don't know. But for 38 years, he'd not been able to walk. And Jesus, he sees this guy, and he sees kind of the desperation this guy has. And he's like, hey, look, what's going on? Do you want to be made well? And the guy's like, that's why I'm here. I just all day, every day, I'm sitting here and I'm just waiting. But the problem is I can't walk, and it's really hard to shove myself into the water before everybody else, And so I don't have any friends, I don't have family. Nobody's going to help me. It's this whole thing. And so Jesus just decides, look, the magic pool is kind of a fun story, but I don't need it. And Jesus heals the guy. It's really a nice story, guys, walking around with his mat, dancing around, I'm sure, skipping. He's probably skipping, let's skip. In my head, if I wasn't able to walk for 38 years, I would skip. I would also gallop. Remember when you were a kid and you galloped everywhere? And then you hit 10 and you're like, don't gallop. That's for children. We should gallop. We should have galloping in the Olympics. I know Usain Bolt is amazing at running, but maybe He's not a great galloper. I don't know. Anyway, so the man gallops, and that's that. And Jesus, this happens to be the Sabbath. Jesus heals this guy on the Sabbath, and the Pharisees are really angry because Jesus has healed a man on the Sabbath, and healing a man is considered work. That's in John. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all kind of tell the same story. They have a couple of stories they all tell. They all tell them a little bit different, but a couple of stories they tell, and it's of the Sabbath. And the first one it's about Jesus' disciples. Right? Jesus' disciples are walking through a field, and they're, it's a Sabbath, it's a Saturday, and they're hungry, and so they're walking through this field, and they're picking, wheat off of the stalks, and you think, well, that's stealing, right? In our society, that would be stealing. Don't go to farms and just take stuff. Don't do that. But in their society, that was kind of their like social safety net. Like that was like their welfare system. It was kind of built into the society that if you needed to eat, if you were going to starve, you could go to somebody else's field and take what you could carry, and then you could eat it, right? It's much different than like harvesting, except to the Pharisees who said that's the same as harvesting. And so Jesus' disciples are doing this, and immediately, somebody goes and tells on him, of course, probably named Karen. And so Karen goes and tells on the disciples, and then they come back, and it's right, there are Karens in the Bible too. Not a new phenomenon. And so they come back and like, hey, why are your disciples breaking the Sabbath? And, just finding that. There's another story, another one, and Jesus this time, like, instead of waiting to get attacked by somebody, Jesus is in the temple, and again, it's a Saturday, it's a Sabbath, and he sees a guy with a withered hand. I have no more explanation for what that is. I don't know what that is. Just a tiny hand, just very not good. So Jesus, instead of waiting, he actually just kind of gets the guy, and he's like, hey, you guys don't want me to heal this guy because it's Saturday, and I think that's dumb. So then he just heals him in front of him. Jesus is just like being antagonistic at this point, which is why I love Jesus so much. Like, I would love him for like the saving me thing, but like he's also hilarious. So, and we have these three stories, right? And so it's kind of just a theme. Like, I don't get the impression that this is the only time that these things happen. And so every time that Jesus does something on the Sabbath, it turns into a fight. It turns into an argument, because apparently arguing is at work to the Jewish leaders. You can attack a guy all day, and that's fine, but it becomes a fight. And Jesus tries to argue in a lot of different ways. Like, he tries to, like, there's times when, like, he quotes the Bible, he quotes scripture, like, well, it's a story with David, and he's trying to get them to understand something, or, sometimes he tries to use, like, logic reason, like, hey, if it were you, like, imagine it's you, and you've got, like, a donkey, and he falls into a ravine, like, he tries that. Jesus tries a lot of different things. At one point, he's just kind of like, with that withered hand guy, it was, like, almost trying to, like, get them to think empathetically, compassionately. Like, what would you do if it was you? And nothing works. And I think the problem is, the reason nothing worked was because Jesus had broken the Sabbath. And again, I mentioned a couple times preachers who teach these things. I've heard so many explanations of these things trying to explain why Jesus doesn't break the Sabbath. The theological pretzels we try to twist ourselves into to say Jesus didn't break the Sabbath. I'm here to tell you Jesus broke the Sabbath. Okay? He did. We just talked about it. That story with 1,000 people, right? We just talked about it. You can break the Sabbath in only if and when your life depends on it. That is the consensus understanding of the Sabbath in Jesus' day that went back like 150 years. Okay? You can only do it if your life depends on it. And none of these stories, like the guy who was, crippled for 38 years, I mean, I don't want to sound harsh, but like 38 years in a day isn't going to make a big difference. Heal him on Sunday and nobody cares. Like, nobody's going to give Jesus, nobody's going to hassle Jesus if he heals the guy on Sunday. The same thing with the guy with the withered hand. Like, that guy did not go to the temple that day expecting a miracle. Of course he didn't. Because he knows, first of all, probably not going to get a miracle because he hadn't gotten it up to that point. And number two, if you're going to get a miracle, you're going to get it on Friday or Sunday or Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday or Thursday, but not Saturday. He knows. Jesus does that unsolicited. And with his disciples, look, I get maybe they were hungry. Maybe they were hangry, okay? We've all been there. But one of the core spiritual disciplines of the Jewish faith is fasting. Jesus, as he begins his ministry, doesn't eat for 40 days. Like, the disciples would have been fine. They might have been cranky if they didn't eat until, sundown or whatever, but they would have been fine. In all of these stories, Jesus is doing a good thing, but an unnecessary thing when it comes to life and death. And therefore, says Mattathias, says the consensus of Jewish teaching on the subject, Jesus was breaking the Sabbath. And if I haven't convinced you of that, let's read a passage where Jesus admits to breaking the Sabbath. Here we go. John chapter 5. This is after the whole thing with the pool, with the guy in the pool, the magic water. This is what he says. It says, so the Jewish leaders begin harassing Jesus for breaking the Sabbath rules. But Jesus replied, my Father is always working, and so am I. That's not even trying to argue. You're breaking the rules. I am, in fact. Yeah, actually, it says Jesus. Why are you breaking the rules? Well, I can. Like, that's it. That's all that it is. In fact, it's almost like he's being insulting because he doesn't just say, like, I love working on Saturdays. He says, I am always working, which, of course, folds in Saturdays. But remember the whole premise of the Sabbath is that God worked for 6 days, and then God didn't work on day 7. Jesus is saying, well, guys, you may be reading too much into that story. God is always working. Like, did you think that was literal, that God didn't work on Saturday? You guys thought, let me tell you, that was not literal, Pharisees. That's insulting, guys. Literally, after this story, the Pharisees are like, we got to go find some people to kill Jesus. Like, that guy not only is breaking the law, but he is humiliating us while we do it. And so that we're left with this thing where we say, okay, well, Jesus breaks the law and admits to it, is unashamed of doing it, and is explaining it in insulting ways to his fellow Jewish people. What do we do with that? Like, how does this apply for us? Well, there's another thing that Jesus ends up saying about the Sabbath. Another time where he gives an explanation. And I think that will help us to understand what we're supposed to do with this stuff, okay? This is what we're reading this time in the Gospel according to Mark. This was after the guy with the withered hand. It says, Jesus said to them, the Sabbath was made to meet the needs of the people, and not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even over the Sabbath. I just need to preface what I'm going to finish the sermon with by understanding that everything I'm about to say can be taken the wrong way. I'm going to ask you guys not to do that. Okay? And I know you're like, well, how do I know what's the right way and the wrong way? I know it's hard, but bear with me. You see, there are these two kind of polar opposite ends of the church. On the one hand, there's people who essentially seem to think that, like, all of Christianity is just a thing to follow the rules. That, like, Christianity has just 1,000 things you're supposed to do, 1,000 things you're not supposed to do, and the entire purpose of Christianity is to do those things and to not do those things, to make sure you get it right, to make sure you have the right everything. You believe the right things, you say the right things, you do the right things, you don't believe the wrong things, you don't do the wrong things, you don't say the wrong things, because Christianity is all about rule following, and if you don't do it, well, God is going to be very, very angry and he's going to thump you. The you've probably been to some churches like that. You've certainly met Christians like that. On the other side of the perspective, the spectrum here, are people, and I know you've met these people too, who are like, well, I have freedom in Christ, and that means I get to do anything I want at any point for any reason, no matter what, when, how. No one's the boss of me. I do what I want because for God so loved the world. And he loves me. And that means I do whatever I want. You met Christians like that too. I'll be honest, most of us are just like that same Christian, just back and forth. Ping pong. Like, a lot of us at least, just kind of ping pong back and forth. It's really important that we understand that Jesus' relationship with the law, which is to say, Jesus' relationship with God's rules, is different than both of those, right? It's very different than both of those. On the one hand, if Christianity is all just following rules, what is the point of grace? What is the point of mercy? What is the point of the cross? If I can know God through following rules, I have no need for God to become a person. The incarnation is useless at that point. But on the other hand, if my life does not look any different because I believe in Jesus than when I did before, in what sense is Jesus my Lord? In what sense am I following Jesus at all? Jesus instead teaches us something that's very, very important. And it's really kind of a two-step thing. The first step is this. When God gives us rules, when God gives us laws, God gives us guidance, maybe, that's a gift from God. The Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people, Jesus says. Right? The Sabbath was God's gift to us. It was never meant to be a burden at all. It was never meant to say, like, okay, it's Saturday, better not do good things. Okay, it's Saturday, better run around on Friday to make sure I get everything done so that way it's kind of like, you go on vacation, like day before vacation, every time I'm always like, why am I doing this? Like, this is not relaxing. There's no world whatever we're going to do is worth the agony of the day before when every article of clothing I've ever owned is laid out. Right? When you're like, I got a list this long of stuff I got to do, and I'm on a time frame. And if you throw a plane into that, oh my gosh. It's kind of like that, right? Like, it's not meant to make things harder. It's not meant to be a burden. It's meant to be a gift. The Sabbath was a gift. The Sabbath was God telling the Jewish people, you are not defined by your labor. You are not defined by your work or your productivity. I love you on the day that you are not doing anything as much as I love you on the days you are doing all the things. That's the Sabbath. And it's wonderful. This belief that we are not defined by our productivity, but we are defined by who we are as human beings made in the image of God. Man, we need more of that. We need more Sabbath, not less. But on the other hand, Jesus says, he is Lord of the Sabbath. So that means on a Saturday, he doesn't want to do it. He doesn't have to do it. And I know, look, when I say that sentence, it's like, whoa, so I don't have to do anything in the Bible. Remember what I just said? Everything the Bible lays out is for our good, right? God does not give instructions that are burdensome. If we do what God says, right, it doesn't make our life worse. It makes it better. But also, part of what this means is having the wisdom and the discernment to know when we don't need to follow rules anymore. Or when we don't need to follow that rule anymore. Or when we don't need to follow that rule today, and we'll pick it back up next week. Jesus doesn't do away with the law and the prophets. He instead lives in such a way that he shows us the purpose of the law and the prophets. The law and the prophets, Everything God has given us is a gift. And if we do what God says, our lives are better. But also, sometimes you find a guy with a withered hand. Sometimes your disciples are hungry. And it is absurd to imagine God giving us a rule and then saying, well, I got to follow this rule. Because the rule itself is never the thing. It's what the rule is pointing to. Meaning, it was never about not working on Saturday. It was about understanding your worth and value as a person as you rested one day a week. And we can do this with any of these rules in the Bible. When we use rules to exclude people, when we use rules to deny people, when we like, well, this is a Bible verse, so I guess I can't do that, we're doing it wrong. And that doesn't mean we ignore all the stuff. It just means there's a time and a place where being godly and being righteous means following the rules to a T. And there's a time and a place where being righteous and godly means doing away with the rule as if it wasn't there in the first place. And that following Christ, the Lord of the Sabbath, our Lord, the one who guides and directs us, the one whose opinion is supposed to matter above and beyond anybody else. That's what it means for Jesus to be your Lord, is that what Christ thinks is what's important, not what anybody else does, including ourselves. That what we do following him in his example. It's not about rules. It's about the wisdom to know when the rule is good and when the rule is bad. Jesus does not do away with the Sabbath at all. But from time to time, he ignored it. That's the example for us each and every day. We're in the second week of our series called Wanted. Talking about why people wanted to kill Jesus. And as we explore the Sabbath, as we explore all of this, we get to a very difficult lesson to live out, but a lesson that is very, very important if we are people who, instead of using this as an excuse to do whatever, if we, in good faith, approach our relationship with Christ this way, this is the way that our life should be. Our second lesson from our series called Wanted is this. There's a time to follow the rules. There's a time to break the rules, and all of this is a gift from God. There's a time to follow the rules. There's a time to break the rules, and all of this is a gift from God. Dave and Stephanie are going to come up. We're going to sing a song. Hopefully it's in the PowerPoint. If not, well, what are you going to do? You know, you guys can just pretend. By the way, as an aside, I love the people, like some of you guys are just puzzled, just like, I don't know what this is. Some of y'all try to follow along, like, and that's fantastic. Y'all are trying, and I just love it. Anyway, we have an invitation, but it's just the same invitation we do all the time. The Bible teaches we should repent to be baptized. Sounds like two things. Just one, repent, we're willing to change. We turn our lives over to Christ. In baptism, we are aligning ourselves symbolically with who Christ is in his life, death, and resurrection. If you want to do some of that stuff, let's talk. If you're an immersed believer in Christ, you're looking for a perfect church home, this place is not it. We do serve a perfect God. We want to connect, we want to call, we want to cultivate, we want to meet new people, we want to share the gospel, we want to grow while we do it. We want to be people with the wisdom to know when we follow the rules, when we don't, and the wisdom to know most of all that we are always following Christ. As we stand,